My cheating wife and her boyfriend took out a secret loan on my ranch, so I faked a massive lawsuit and left them both completely broke. I'm 42 years old, and I honestly believe that the absolute most terrifying predators in the world do not hide in the dark alleys. They sit right across from you at the breakfast table, drinking expensive coffee that you completely paid for, while quietly plotting your absolute destruction. I don't know why I was so incredibly blind. When I married my wife, Valerie, about 8 years ago, she seemed like the absolute perfect partner for my specific lifestyle. I am a senior commercial airline pilot for a massive international carrier. I fly massive wide-body jets on completely exhausting international routes. Because of my seniority, I make a very high, mid-six-figure salary. But the absolute massive drawback is my schedule. I am routinely completely out of the country for 5 to 6 consecutive days, sleeping in expensive hotel rooms in foreign cities, working entirely completely erratic hours. I needed a wife who was independent and trustworthy. Valerie swore she loved the quiet, independent life. Exactly 5 years ago, I used the vast majority of my corporate savings to purchase my absolute dream property. It was a completely pristine, 200-acre ranch nestled deep in the mountains. It had a massive custom-built stone mansion, a huge barn, and a beautiful private lake. I worked grueling 60-hour flight weeks to completely pay off the massive mortgage. Exactly 1 year ago, I made the absolute final payment. The massive $3,500,000 ranch was completely, entirely paid off. No banks, no massive loans. It was my completely free and clear sanctuary to come home to after crossing multiple time zones. But Valerie completely hated the ranch. She hated the quiet. She hated the isolation. She wanted to be in the center of the massive city, going to expensive clubs, eating at luxury restaurants, and living a completely glamorous, high society lifestyle. We fought about it constantly, but I completely refused to sell my dream property. I thought we were just going through a completely normal, rough patch in our marriage. I had absolutely no idea that she was actively, methodically plotting to completely steal my entire life's work. Exactly 3 months ago, I was scheduled to fly a massive, highly critical international route to Tokyo, Japan. I was supposed to be completely gone for exactly 7 days. Valerie drove me to the airport. She kissed me at the drop-off curb, smiled this incredibly sweet, loving smile, and told me to completely stay safe in the skies. I boarded the massive jet. We went through our standard pre-flight checklists. But right before pushback, the massive aircraft suffered a catastrophic, unfixable hydraulic failure. The entire flight was completely canceled. Because I was already completely exhausted and approaching my maximum legal flight hours for the month, the airline completely took me off the schedule. They told me to go home and take the entire week off. I didn't call Valerie to tell her I was coming home exactly 6 days early. I just took a quiet taxi cab back to the mountains, completely hoping to surprise her with a romantic dinner. I arrived at the massive ranch around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Valerie's luxury SUV was completely gone. I walked up the long driveway, completely exhausted. I stopped at the massive stone mailbox at the end of the property just to grab the daily letters. There was a thick, heavy, certified envelope from a massive, highly aggressive national bank sitting right on top of the pile. It was addressed directly to me. I tore the heavy envelope open, completely expecting it to be a standard credit card offer. I pulled out the thick stack of financial documents, and my heart completely, instantly stopped beating. The blood literally turned to absolute freezing ice in my veins. It wasn't a credit card offer. It was a completely finalized, officially notarized final disbursement notice for a massive home equity line of credit. Someone had just taken out a completely massive $1,500,000 loan against my fully paid off $3 million ranch. I literally stopped breathing. I dropped my heavy pilot's bag right onto the dirt driveway. I completely tore through the pages. Right at the bottom of the final page, completely officially notarized, was Valerie's signature. And right next to her signature was my signature. But I was completely supposed to be 30,000 feet in the air over the Pacific Ocean on the exact date the document was signed. I had absolutely never seen this paperwork before in my entire natural life. Valerie hadn't just taken out a small secret credit card. She had maliciously, deliberately hired a completely corrupt notary public to forge my legal signature on massive federal bank documents. She had completely leveraged my entire paid-off sanctuary to steal $1.5 million in pure cash. I didn't scream. I didn't completely panic. My absolute cold pilot training immediately took over my brain. In a massive crisis, you do not panic. You assess the instruments, you secure the cabin, and you execute the emergency protocol. I walked into the completely silent stone mansion. I went directly into Valerie's massive luxury closet. I spent exactly 3 hours completely tearing her expensive things apart until I found her locked, heavy fireproof lockbox hidden behind a stack of designer shoes. I broke the lockbox open with a heavy steel hammer. Inside was the absolute catastrophic reality of my wife's entire secret life. There were hundreds of printed text messages and emails between Valerie and a man named Derek. Derek was a completely sleazy, failed commercial real estate agent who lived right in the center of the city. They had been carrying on a massive, highly toxic affair for exactly 2 entire years. Every single time I flew an international route, Derek was completely sleeping in my custom bed. The printed emails completely laid out their entire sociopathic master plan. Derek had used his sleazy real estate connections to find the corrupt notary. They forged my signature to secure the massive $1,500,000 loan. The certified letter I found was just the confirmation. The actual money had already been completely wired into a completely hidden, offshore joint bank account under Valerie and Derek's names exactly 24 hours ago. Their plan was completely horrifying. They were going to use the stolen $1.5 million to buy a massive, luxury penthouse in the city. And the exact day I returned from my Tokyo flight, Valerie was going to completely blindside me with divorce papers, leaving me completely stuck, paying off a massive 15-year loan on a ranch I thought I already owned. I sat on the floor of her expensive closet, completely surrounded by the evidence of her absolute betrayal. They thought they had committed the absolute perfect, untraceable financial crime against an exhausted pilot who was completely out of the country. I carefully packed the forged documents, the printed emails, and the bank routing numbers into my briefcase. I completely cleaned up the closet, leaving absolutely zero trace that I had broken into her lockbox. I walked right back out the front door, got into my personal truck, and drove completely straight to the absolute most ruthless, terrifying aviation and family law attorney in the entire state, because I wasn't just going to file for divorce. I was going to make them legally assume a massive, completely inescapable nightmare that would completely destroy their entire future. I didn't completely lose my mind and speed back to the ranch to confront her. When you're a senior commercial airline pilot, you are completely trained to handle catastrophic emergencies at 30,000 feet in the air. You do not let your emotions completely hijack the controls. You secure the massive aircraft, you isolate the failure, and you execute the absolute most devastating emergency protocol necessary to survive. I sat in the plush, imported leather chair of a massive glass-walled conference room right in the center of the downtown financial district. My corporate attorney, a man who charged exactly $900 an hour, looked at the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged bank documents and the printed emails between Valerie and her completely sleazy affair partner, Derek. He took off his expensive reading glasses and completely shook his head in absolute silent disbelief. He told me it was one of the most incredibly brazen, entirely stupid financial crimes he had ever seen in his entire 35-year legal career. He told me that by using a corrupt notary to forge a massive federal banking document and route exactly $1,500,000 into a secret offshore joint account, Valerie and Derek had completely committed massive, felony-level international wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. We could call the federal banking authorities right this exact second, my lawyer told me, his voice entirely, completely serious. We could have them both in heavy steel handcuffs before the sun goes down tonight. I looked at him, and I completely, slowly shook my head. I don't just want them in handcuffs, I told him, keeping my voice incredibly cold and perfectly steady. I want to watch them completely panic. I want them to willingly, frantically rip up that massive home equity loan. I want to watch Derek's entire, sleazy real estate ego completely collapse in real time. My lawyer leaned back in his expensive chair. I told him my entire, highly calculated master plan. He actually let out a massive, booming laugh and told me it was the most brilliantly evil corporate trap he had ever legally sanctioned in his entire life. Because I am a senior international pilot, I deal with massive, highly classified federal aviation compliance regulations every single day. I know exactly what official, terrifying government investigative documents look like. I have complete access to the exact legal jargon, the incredibly dense formatting, and the completely terrifying federal penalty structures. I went to a quiet, expensive hotel downtown, opened my personal laptop, and spent exactly 7 uninterrupted hours drafting a completely fake, incredibly comprehensive, 90-page classified federal aviation assessment. The document looked absolutely 100% legitimate. It had massive, intimidating federal aviation seals. It was completely filled with terrifying clauses about immediate asset forfeiture, international smuggling rings, and massive, undischargeable financial liability. The fake federal document explicitly stated that the government had just uncovered a massive, highly illegal international smuggling ring operating out of my specific airline. It claimed that because I was the senior pilot on those specific Asian routes, I was the absolute primary target of a massive classified federal investigation. But the absolute most brilliant, terrifying clause I drafted was buried right on page exactly 4. The fake federal mandate explicitly stated that the government was issuing an immediate, undischargeable mandatory criminal fine of exactly $25 million against me. And it explicitly stated that any individual listed as a spouse, or absolutely anyone who had recently taken out a massive financial lien or loan against my primary residence, was immediately legally classified as a co-conspirator in the international smuggling ring. Furthermore, the document stated that any co-conspirator attached to the ranch's finances would be immediately held personally liable for the entire $25 million federal debt, and they would absolutely face a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 30 years in a federal penitentiary. It was an absolute flawless masterpiece of psychological destruction. I printed the massive thick stack of papers, put them in a heavy red classification folder, and I waited exactly 3 days to make my grand entrance. On a rainy Thursday evening, exactly when I was originally supposed to be landing from my Tokyo flight, I took a taxi back to the mountain ranch. I completely messed up my hair. I completely untucked my uniform shirt, and I forced myself to look absolutely, physically exhausted, terrified, and completely broken. I walked through the massive custom front door. Valerie was sitting on the expensive living room couch, drinking a glass of imported wine, probably completely dreaming about exactly how she and Derek were going to spend my stolen $1.5 million. She jumped up from the couch when she saw me in my pilot uniform. She smiled this entirely fake, sickeningly sweet smile and walked over to give me a massive hug. I completely ignored her outstretched arms. I walked right past her, dropped the heavy red folder directly onto the custom coffee table, and collapsed into my heavy leather armchair. I put my head in my hands and let out a massive, completely shaking groan. "Valerie," I whispered, making my voice shake with absolute, completely fake panic. "We are completely, entirely ruined. Everything is entirely gone." Valerie's completely fake smile vanished instantly. She put her wine glass down and asked me what was going on. I looked up at her, pretending I was completely fighting back massive tears. I told her that federal agents had completely intercepted my flight in Tokyo. I told her that the federal government was completely seizing the $3,500,000 mountain ranch. I told her I was being investigated for a massive classified international smuggling ring, and that my entire career was completely over. Valerie literally stopped breathing. The blood completely, entirely drained from her face. But then, I dropped the absolute nuclear bomb. I grabbed her hands, pretending to be completely desperate. And the worst part, I told her, my voice completely cracking, is the federal liability. They are issuing a massive criminal fine of exactly $25 million. They told me that if anyone tries to divorce me right now, or if anyone is completely attached to the financial liens on this ranch, the federal government will hold them entirely, personally liable for the complete $25 million. And whoever is attached to that bank loan will absolutely go to a federal penitentiary for 30 entire years. I swear, I actually watched her complete soul entirely leave her body in real time. She went completely, totally ghost white. She violently pulled her hands away from me, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the stone fireplace. She wasn't worried about me going to prison. The absolute terrifying realization that she and her sleazy boyfriend had just legally, voluntarily forged a massive federal banking loan against the exact property the federal government was supposedly seizing completely shattered her brain. She realized that by forging that exact $1,500,000 loan, she had just legally signed herself and Derek up for 30 years in a federal penitentiary as co-conspirators. She started completely stammering, entirely unable to form a coherent sentence. She told me she felt physically sick. She said she needed to use the restroom immediately. She practically ran down the massive hardwood hallway, completely abandoning me in my fake moment of absolute, complete despair. I heard the heavy master bathroom door slam shut, and I heard the heavy brass lock click. I didn't stay in the living room. I walked completely silently down the hallway and pressed my ear right against the solid wooden door. I didn't have to strain to hear her at all. Valerie was literally screaming into her cell phone. She had called Derek. "Derek, you have to fix it." Valerie screamed, completely sobbing hysterically into the phone. "The federal government is completely seizing the ranch. He is being investigated for a massive international smuggling ring. The government says whoever took out a financial loan against the estate is going to a federal penitentiary for 30 years and owes them exactly $25 million. We have to rip up the loan. We have to wire the entire money back to the bank right this exact second before the federal agents completely find us." I stood in the completely silent hallway, pressing my hand forcefully over my mouth to keep from absolutely laughing out loud. The trap had completely, flawlessly snapped shut. They were absolutely, completely terrified. And they were about to entirely tear their own massive financial crime apart just to save their own pathetic skins. I stood completely still in the quiet, expansive hallway, pressing my hand tightly over my mouth to keep from absolutely laughing out loud. Through the heavy wooden master bathroom door, I could hear Valerie and her incredibly sleazy affair partner Derek completely losing their minds. Valerie was hyperventilating, repeating the entirely fake, terrifying federal aviation penalties I had just completely invented. She kept crying about the 30 years in a federal penitentiary and the massive $25 million criminal fine. I quietly backed away from the door, walked back into the massive living room, and sat down in my heavy leather armchair. I put my head in my hands and went right back to playing the role of the completely broken, terrified airline pilot who was facing a massive federal crisis. Exactly 20 minutes later, the bathroom door slowly opened. Valerie walked back into the living room. She looked like she had physically aged exactly 15 years in the span of 20 minutes. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, her eyes were entirely bloodshot, and her hands were physically trembling so hard she could barely hold her expensive cell phone. She walked over to me, sat down on the edge of the custom coffee table, and reached out to grab my hands. They were absolutely ice cold. She looked me right in the eyes, and she spun the most absolutely pathetic, entirely transparent lie I have ever heard in my entire natural life. "Honey," she whispered, her voice completely shaking, "I have to confess something to you. I did something exactly 2 weeks ago, and I only did it because a financial advisor told me it would be a massive, wonderful investment for our future." I looked up at her, pretending to be completely confused. She took a massive, shaking breath. She told me that she had been incredibly worried about my completely exhausting flight schedule. She claimed that she had found a massive corporate real estate opportunity in the city, and she wanted to handle all the boring paperwork for me so I could just retire early and come home to a massive pile of passive income. And then, she actually admitted the massive felony. But she completely tried to spin it as a massive, loving favor to me. "I forged your signature on a home equity loan," she cried, squeezing my hands. "I hired a notary, and I took exactly $1,500,000 out against the ranch. I was just trying to be a good wife. But now, the massive loan is officially attached to the property." I ripped my hands violently away from her. I stood up from the armchair, and I put on the absolute greatest acting performance of my entire life. I yelled. I paced around the massive living room. I acted completely, utterly horrified, screaming that she had committed a massive federal financial felony and forged my legal signature. I yelled that she had completely ruined everything and that now the federal aviation government was going to arrest her for attempting to launder massive funds through an internationally condemned property. Valerie completely broke down. She collapsed onto the expensive living room rug, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged me to forgive her. She begged me to absolutely help her fix it. "We have to cancel the massive loan," Valerie screamed, looking up at me from the floor. "The real estate broker who helped me is driving up the mountain right this exact second. We have to wire the entire money back to the bank and completely dissolve the financial lien before the federal agents find out we took the cash." Exactly 35 minutes later, the heavy front door flew open. Derek burst into my living room. He didn't look like an arrogant, successful real estate mogul. He was completely sweating through his cheap designer suit. He was absolutely pale, completely hyperventilating, and clutching a thick leather briefcase directly to his chest. Derek didn't even try to introduce himself or play it cool. He actually marched right up to the coffee table and started completely panicking, entirely ignoring me, to scream at Valerie. "We have to completely invalidate this loan," Derek yelled, pointing a shaking finger at his briefcase. "I cannot be legally attached to a $25 million federal smuggling ring. I am not going to a federal penitentiary for 30 years because your idiot husband flies airplanes for a cartel." I just nodded my head, looking completely defeated and entirely broken. I told them that if they didn't completely reverse the massive wire transfer and legally dissolve the home equity lien right this exact second, the federal investigators would completely freeze all of their secret bank accounts by tomorrow morning. Derek completely panicked. He admitted right there in my living room that they had already received the massive $1,500,000 wire into their secret offshore account. "You have to wire it back." I screamed at him, playing the terrified pilot perfectly. "If you hold on to a single penny of that stolen bank money, the federal government will charge you with massive international money laundering." Derek didn't even hesitate for a single second. He pulled out his cell phone, called his high-end offshore banking concierge, and completely frantically authorized an immediate, massive wire reversal back to the National Bank. I stood right there in my living room and listened to him completely drain his secret joint account. Because international wire reversals carry a massive percentage-based penalty fee, Derek willingly paid exactly $75,000 of his own personal money just to send the entire $1.5 million right back to the lender. He completely forfeited his entire life savings out of sheer absolute terror. Then, I told them we needed to leave for the massive National Bank branch completely, immediately. We didn't ride in the same car. I drove my massive truck, and Valerie and Derek piled into his leased luxury sedan. I watched them in my rearview mirror the entire drive down the mountain. They were driving completely erratically, absolutely terrified to get the massive federal liability entirely off their records. We arrived at the massive bank branch exactly 1 hour later. We walked into the bright, completely sterile lobby. The branch manager looked absolutely confused when Derek slammed his briefcase down onto his desk. Derek completely demanded that the manager print out a massive, legally binding document entirely dissolving the home equity line of credit and completely removing the financial lien from the $3,500,000 ranch. Because the massive funds had completely cleared the wire reversal, The bank manager didn't even argue. He saw how completely unhinged Derek and Valerie were, and he printed the massive legal lien release documents immediately. Valerie and Derek didn't even read the massive stack of paperwork. Their hands were shaking so incredibly badly that they could barely hold the heavy black pen. They were absolutely convinced that federal aviation agents were going to burst through the massive glass doors at any second and arrest them for international smuggling. They signed their names. They legally officially dissolved the entire massive loan. They completely surrendered any and all financial claims to the property, effectively clearing my title completely. The bank manager stamped the document with his heavy official seal. He signed his name, officially validating the complete reversal and removing the massive lien. I reached across the mahogany desk and I picked up the heavy legal folder containing the freshly signed lien release documents. I looked at the fresh black ink. I felt the physical weight of the folder in my hands. The entire $3,500,000 ranch was completely entirely mine again. No forged loans, no secret financial liens, no encumbrances. I slowly tucked the heavy folder perfectly under my arm. And then, the entire atmosphere in the quiet bank office instantly shifted. I didn't look completely terrified anymore. I stopped slumping my broad shoulders. I completely dropped the fake, panicked breathing. I stood up straight, completely adjusted my pilot's jacket, and I looked down at my entirely cheating wife and her absolutely arrogant, totally defeated boyfriend. I just smiled. A completely cold, absolutely terrifying smile. And then, I dropped the absolute final hammer on their entire completely fake reality. I stood up straight, completely adjusted my pilot's jacket, and I looked down at my entirely cheating wife and her absolutely arrogant, totally defeated boyfriend. I just smiled. A completely cold, absolutely terrifying smile. The entire atmosphere in the quiet, sterile bank office instantly shifted. I didn't look completely terrified anymore. I stopped slumping my broad shoulders. I completely dropped the fake, panicked breathing. Valerie looked up at me from her plush leather bank chair. Her bloodshot eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. She could tell something was fundamentally wrong. "Honey," she whispered, her voice completely shaking. "Why are you smiling? We have to get back to the ranch and call the federal aviation agents. We have to tell them the financial lien is completely dissolved." I let out a very slow, completely calm breath. "There are no federal agents, Valerie," I said, my voice completely echoing in the quiet bank office. The three of them completely froze. The bank manager actually stopped breathing. Derek's jaw completely dropped. I looked right into Valerie's terrified eyes, and I completely dismantled her entire universe. "There is no massive federal aviation investigation," I explained, keeping my voice incredibly flat and steady. "There is no international smuggling ring operating out of my airline. There is absolutely no $25 million criminal fine, and nobody is going to a federal penitentiary for 30 years. I made the entire thing up." Valerie literally stopped breathing. She stared at me, completely unable to process the words coming out of my mouth. I tapped the heavy legal folder completely tucked under my arm. "I am a senior commercial airline pilot." I told her, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Did you honestly truly believe you could secretly forge my legal signature on a federal banking document, steal $1,500,000 in pure cash, and I would just never notice? I found the certified letter in the mailbox on Thursday afternoon. I broke into your heavy, fireproof lockbox. I saw the forged signature. I read the hundreds of printed emails spanning your entire 2-year affair. I saw the secret offshore bank routing numbers." Derek started completely stammering. His face turned violently purple. He realized exactly what I had just done. He realized I had just legally tricked them into wiring $1.5 million back to a national bank, paying a massive $75,000 wire penalty fee out of his own pocket, and completely tearing up their own stolen home equity loan. He lunged forward, screaming at the top of his lungs. He reached across the mahogany desk, desperately trying to grab the heavy legal folder right out from under my arm. "You completely tricked us." Derek screamed, his voice absolutely echoing off the bank walls. "You are a completely sick, twisted monster. That was a completely legal financial loan. Give those lien release papers back right this exact second." I easily stepped back, completely out of his reach. "No," I said quietly. "It was a massive, felony-level financial crime. You forged a federal bank document. You committed international wire fraud. And because you were in such a massive, completely blind panic, you just legally signed away every single shred of the massive loan you thought you had stolen." I looked directly at the entirely confused bank manager, who was completely sweating behind his desk. "And if either of you try to fight me on this," I said, making absolutely sure the bank manager heard me, "I have high-resolution photographs of the originally forged banking documents. I have the printed affair emails. I have the joint offshore banking information. I will take every single piece of evidence straight to the district attorney, and I will make absolutely sure that both of you actually go to a federal penitentiary for real." Valerie actually let out this massive, completely blood-curdling scream. She covered her face with her hands and collapsed forward onto the mahogany desk. She realized she had just legally confessed to a massive felony, lost a completely free $1.5 million, and destroyed her entire 8-year marriage in one single afternoon. I looked down at her completely shaking, sobbing form. I am filing for divorce the exact second the family courthouse opens tomorrow morning, I told her. Do not bother coming back to my mountain ranch. Your expensive clothes and your designer shoes are already sitting in heavy black trash bags at the end of the dirt driveway. And if you ever, even for a single second, try to come after my corporate pilot pension or my completely paid-off property, I will make the international wire fraud charges completely official. I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't listen to Derek's absolute unhinged screaming. I turned around, walked completely out of the sterile bank office, got into my massive truck, and I drove away. The legal fallout over the next 8 months was absolutely incredibly brutal for her and her sleazy boyfriend, because I held the absolute concrete proof of their massive felony forgery. Valerie didn't dare fight me in the divorce proceedings. She didn't hire an aggressive family lawyer. She didn't demand a single penny of my massive mid-6-figure salary, and she absolutely did not try to claim any equity in the $3,500,000 ranch. She signed the divorce papers completely quietly, absolutely terrified that I was going to send her to prison if she pushed back. She walked away from a completely luxurious, financially secure life with absolutely nothing but her trash bags. Derek's entire life completely, catastrophically imploded. Because he had frantically reversed the massive offshore wire transfer and drained his entire life savings to pay the $75,000 penalty fee, he was completely broke. When the state real estate board got an anonymous tip about his corrupt notary connections, they entirely revoked his commercial license. He can never sell property again. I heard through the massive city grapevine that they are completely miserable. Because they both lost their fake millions and the luxury penthouse they planned to buy, they completely turned on each other. Valerie blames Derek for coming up with the horrible plan to steal the equity. Derek blames Valerie for completely caving under pressure and confessing to the fake federal aviation agents. They absolutely hate each other. Derek had to move into a tiny, completely run-down apartment on the terrible side of town. Valerie is currently renting a cramped, incredibly depressing studio apartment, and she actually has to work a completely standard 50-hour-a-week retail job just to pay her basic utility bills. As for me, I am doing absolutely incredible. I kept my completely pristine 200-acre mountain ranch. I still work my massive commercial pilot job, flying wide-body jets all over the world. But now when I come home from a completely exhausting international route, I sleep incredibly peacefully in my custom stone mansion. I have a massive corporate pension sitting securely in my private investment accounts, entirely safe from any toxic, greedy partners. I learned an incredibly valuable lesson. The absolute best way to completely destroy an arrogant, cheating person isn't to yell at them or try to change their mind. The absolute best way is to completely weaponize their own immense, pathetic greed, step entirely out of the way, and watch them legally dismantle their own entire life.